Good.
Well, we're here. We can start now. So that was a fun intro. Or starting soon. Well, welcome again to our conversation here. This is the third conversation. I'm here with Craig Lindell. My name is Peter Tuddenham, as you might know, and we're talking about encouraging design dialogues as a way to encourage more civic process and respectful appreciation of individual and collective opinions, experiences, and contributions to the well-being of society, whether it's your local neighborhood or a community or an organization or a county or a state or any other combination of people and organizations that have issues they wish to come to some collective understanding of. So, Craig, you've been doing a lot of research, I see, and on Richard Norgard and George Santayana and Alfred North Whitehead. And I was interesting. I'm in the middle this week of an event that's very much about process and reality, which you and I haven't talked about much, but it's honoring the work of Len Troncali and his work on system process theory. And yesterday we had a whole presentation by a colleague of mine, Peter Kawalak, who is the president of the Cybernetics Society in England, on process and the work of Whitehead, and going on to discuss its relevance today. Anyway, I just make reference of that, and you can go to Troncali, TRONCALE.shed.com to see more. So we can talk a little bit about any one of these topics that you've been looking at, and you've got a lot of thoughts on here on where we are and what we need to be thinking about. And where would you like to go today, Craig? You got a lot here to think about.
A lot of that is poking around with artificial intelligence.
Okay.
And because to be clear, I basically have lived a life in business, not in scholarship. And although I have a liberal arts education that I think was, the longer I lived, the more remarkable I think it was. But because I didn't do any reading until I was 15, for reasons of poor testing and so forth, I'm not a good reader. So I've learned to be a good idea hunter. And one of the things I find intriguing about process, as I think about it in the social systems we live in, certainly in this country, the United States, we are very much event driven and not process driven.
Well,
We don't.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's part of the real problem is that we think of things and we think of events and we think of objects, and when we say an English word, and the English language doesn't help us in this, we tend to think of a fixed state, whereas everything is moving all the time, and it's all in this state, as Whitehead might say, of becoming. And it's really interesting to start getting your head around the whole notion of process as a philosophy, as an epistemology, as an ontology as well, and then how do you actually live it in real life is the sort of some of the questions we've been exploring, and encouraging people to change their worldview really in how they approach things.
You have to indulge me my habit. My books are all around me, and sometimes I have to just go for a quote. And I have a wonderful quote from Whitehead on this. Just
All right.
let me get the
Yeah,
book.
well, you go find the quote. I do think that we need to explore this philosophy of process or process, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on, more.
There's a dimension to it that I think is really intriguing. Now, why is it not showing up where I thought it would show up? It goes something like this. When thinking historically, it's important to consider the obtuseness of language as we wrestle with novel thought.
Hmm.
And I don't know why it doesn't show up in the place that I thought it was, um, but that's age. So the what's interesting to me, well, as you know, one of our colleagues, Tom Flanagan, who's written a book called The Talking Point, um,
Yeah.
with I think with Christakis. Um,
Hmm.
Tom likes to argue that words don't have meaning. Meaning is in search of words,
Hmm.
and so the more I have been focusing on the issues that we're dealing with here, is that um, it's the language that gets us confused.
Right.
And as we struggle not only for a clarity to the language we're using, but also a clarity for the world that we're living in. And Lauren Isley likes to say, "In what world are we? We sometimes we see more, and sometimes we see less, and we never know what world we're in." There's a confusion um, that is lost somewhere between the obtuseness of language and the stress in the social system as people try to struggle with how they define it for themselves and others. And of course, the argument in the prior discussions has been that to some extent, I think it's legitimate to say that the stresses that we see in the social system are because we're mourning the loss of our worldviews.
Well, they're based on an evolution of sort of a mechanistic position, and I think that Whitehead's contrast is to the more organic sense, and maybe that is, the mechanical view in a sense has a certain fixedness and predictability, whereas the organic perhaps is much more unpredictable. And so maybe that's part of the issue here, is that there is a loss of the predictable as life gets more intense, more connected up, communicating wise. I mean, we're all communicating more quickly, everything with everything, social media, and so on and so forth. And the traditional structures just can't deal with what's emerging, even the
Yes.
speed at which you can get to things through AI and stuff. So
So I think we thought last time that we jumped from three different thinkers that would be probably known
yeah,
to many, and the I didn't go back as far as George de Santa Anna and my thinking there. I went back to Drucker in 1969
okay,
in his Age of Discontinuity, where he predicted that the social structures, institutions with which we had emerged from a depression and a war, and were not going to be sufficient to deal with the emerging complexity which was coming at us.
right,
And to just clarify how that echoes around what Reagan said that about government being the problem, what I think Drucker would have said, it's not government that's the problem, it's the nature of governance as we practice it that's the problem.
right,
And
right,
and
right,
and so and for the people who are listening, that 1969 was followed. Drucker, I think, was influenced by the Berkeley bubble, which was West Churchman, and that thinking that emerged about that time in terms of how powerful complexity was. And that takes us to the Club of Rome's publication in 1970 that's very little known, called The Predicament of Mankind, which identified 49 enormous world problems that were complex, intricately interrelated, inseparable, and therefore dangerous. Remember, we have been thinking mechanically that if we had a problem, we could find a solution. And if you found a part that was broken in a machine, you simply replace the part that was broken, and the machine would get better. And that was the thinking of the time. And that manifest itself in the assumption that there was progress in history. If we experts made decisions, then and history was social systems were essentially mechanical, then then the social systems would get better. Martin Luther King thought that the arc of history was long, but it curved toward justice. Is the same sense of confidence in the historical process. Um, the breakdown of that came in the 1990s with Richard Norgaard, who began his book Development Betrayed, and toward a coevolutionary strategy for a sustainable future. He started the book by saying we thought science would give us control over nature, the focus on control, which was what Bacon thought science would do, and therefore science had a salvific kind of power in Bacon's mind for the common good. But we thought that science would give us control over nature. We thought technology would improve our quality of life, and we thought reason would give us good government, and not one of the three has happened. So the disillusionment, what Drucker saw as creating a lot of confusion that would not be resolvable because of the failure of our institutions to respond to the complexity that was coming at us. Norgaard and the environmental literature that came out of the 80s and the 90s began to realize that we had to do something much more adaptive, coevolutionary, if you will, because the control over nature was no longer a realistic perspective. We still think that we have control over nature, which is part of the disconnection between the natural world and the way we're still living. The third one was Peter Turchin, who in 2016 wrote a book called The Ages of Discord, where he predicted that I've got a note here somewhere on my desk on Discord, where he predicted that high distortions in the relation in wealth, the value of the distribution of wealth, and always each time you got one of those disconnects, your norms and values would erode. So the average American male hasn't had a increase in real wages since 1972, but between 1984 and I think 2004, Turchin's numbers, something like that, we saw the quadrupling of the number of multimillionaires in this country. And so we had an emergence of an elite and candidly, litigation or internal conflict, combat, if you will, ritualized kind of combat, is part of what generated the wealth for the legal class in that period. Or and then between, I think it was 2022, between something like March and the end of November in 2022, the 650 billionaires in this country added $1 trillion to their collective net worth. Those extremes of wealth, and then those radical events that are random but powerful, like a pandemic or a geological event of some kind, would also erode norms and values. So over that 50-year period, I say 50 years because Drucker projected in 1993 that we were in the middle of what he called a divide, where in a 50-year period we would change our worldviews, our arts, our values, our key institutions, and our social political structures. It's in a book. It's in two books. His book called The New Realities in 1992, and the Post-Capitalist Society in 1993. And he made that projection at a conference at Wharton, where he was the keynote speaker for a new building, and he projected that we'd be coming out of that divide with a new worldview by 2020. And so we think the shattering of the worldviews had to do with some of what I've just explained in that period. You can go back and look at what people like Max Weber were talking about at the turn of the century, where he saw the beginnings of bureaucratization. De Tocqueville worried about bureaucratization being a threat to the formation of voluntary associations, but Max Weber argued that capitalism, devoid of its religious and moral foundation, would be dangerous, that bureaucratization, what he called the iron cage, we would find ourselves living in an iron cage where sensualists without spirit and spiritualists without heart. He characterized them as this nullity would assume that it's risen to the highest form of civilization. So what I think the administrative state represents, the institutions that were problematic, were the legislature giving power over to institutions who were empowered essentially to fulfill their mandate and given the opportunity to make their own rules, which had the power of law in the courts. And those institutions were largely bonding institutions. They turned themselves inward, got stronger and stronger and more rigorous in their behavior. I think a lot of them were basically run by patronage, so they were carelessly managed in some senses, not professionally managed. And the consequences of that in the social system or in the ecological system has been New York Times in the 2023 article on the nature of the conditions of water in the country basically said that the institutions were a threat to our water resource sustainability. So we've run amok and we're not able to create new institutions. And my argument there is we can't create new institutions if the nature of our political discourse is basically event driven and obsessively declarative, because nobody's taking the time to ask questions and connect with sensible discourse that could be done in citizens forums and in design dialogue and other forms of dialogue, or paying attention to the guidance of somebody like Eleanor Ostrom and what it takes for voluntary to develop the voluntary capacity for governing the commons. None of those things are being paid attention to, or none of those things are being asked. No questions are being asked. And if you're not asking questions, then you shut down the possibilities for the subjunctive, which is the imagination that is essential to creating new futures. Does that so we need to get that process in place and be patient with that discovery process, because as I've forgotten the name of the person I was just thinking of, but so let me do this in a dramatic way, and then I'll be quiet and listen for your questions. In 1990, you probably heard me on this before. On this, a fellow named William Irwin Thompson picked up on Nietzsche's comment on the twilight of the idols and the death of God, and he wrote, the future is beyond knowing, but the present is beyond belief. We make so much noise with our technology that we can't see that the Stargate is in our own foreheads. We're obsessively declarative, we're obsessively mechanical, and we're obsessively left brain in the culture. And the guardian seers, who we've been exploring a couple of the guardian seers, but the critical theorists and those who are like Habermas, who are involved with semiotics, and those who are working with psychoanalysis. I put a footnote on this with that comment in a second. Have been the guardian seers that have taken on the Enlightenment and questioned its significance and its tragedy, really. The guardian seers have struck, and the guardian seers have seen the lightning strike the darkness that we call reality, and now we live between the thunder the lightning and the thunder, and the brief interval between the lightning and the thunder. Um, and and one footnote on that, the comment on psychoanalysis, and it goes to the 9/11 um, um, attack. I didn't believe in the 72 virgins being the motivation for running planes into trade towers. And at the back of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon was a black psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, not sure which, who was born in Martinique and educated at the Sorbonne. And he was writing on colonialism and the colonized mind that was alienated from the native that he had group that he had been born into and manipulated by the colonizer that for whom he worked, and the loss of identity in that almost nihilistic extreme of that confusion. The diagnosis was that persecutional delirium and suicidal tendencies mask themselves as terrorism. So that's sort of a melange, if you will, of the kinds of things I think we're struggling with. And you might want to focus on why we think design dialogue is such an important dimension of resolving it. But
Yeah, melange is a good word. Um, well, you've said a lot there, uh, and I think for many people are going, okay, so I can appreciate what you're saying, and how does it now? How can I take all of those aspects and do something in my organization or my community or my association? And I was having this conversation earlier with a colleague about how you do that in an organization or a voluntary association of a professional nature where you have lots of individual experts who might be able to respond to particular um, challenges, and they're in a distributed um, geographically. They're not in one place. There's this tension now between
yep,
working at home and coming into an office, and but in this particular case, it's an organization where people are members and they have an expertise, various specialty expertises, and how to respond to a particular problem situation by gathering the right number of people. And I think one of the things in design dialogue, which may be a limitation in its current structuring or process, as we're talking about process, is that it it at least in some instances requires a lot of research about the problem situation and the identification of the right kind of stakeholders in terms of
yes,
coming together, and that's all time consuming.
yep,
And I think the challenge that the traditional design dialogue has is that it was born in a way in a different world, actually. If you think about it, I mean, John Warfield and Aleko were working on this 30, 40 years ago,
right,
and the world has changed dramatically, as you've just been explaining. And I'm wondering about whether the current manifestation is really fit for purpose. And you and I both attended a sort of training several years ago on one particular software, and it getting people together physically is difficult these days in one place, but certainly for an extended period of time, like 3 days, which is one form of a design dialogue, and then using software to help the process, and having up to 30 people is a kind of recommended number. But I'm just wondering, how we might explore these issues of design dialogue in 2025, perhaps, that might address your points. I mean, even just your last point there about identity and how groups think of themselves. And one of the outcomes of design dialogue is that most people have an experience, some kind of aha experience about their own individual worth and also about the enormous potential of humans coming together in an open way to contribute freely can have a massive revelation and insight into a problem situation and come to some powerful collective understanding to move forward with. So I think those are some very real challenges in 2025, to be honest.
Let me respond in this way. I love to tell the story of moved my family to New York in the 1980s because the business was exploding, and for whatever reasons, and I was watching Daniel Patrick Moynihan interviewed by Tom Fenton on a Sunday morning, and Fenton and the cities were a mess back then, and I had been commuting to New York on a pretty much a weekly basis, living in a hotel, and you couldn't get from my office to the hotel without being hit by a panhandler at least a half a dozen times in Midtown. And so Fenton said to Moynihan, "Senator, are we going to be able to save our cities?" And Moynihan's response was, "Tom, you've asked the wrong question. The question is, are we going to choose to nurture our children?" And if you ask the question, are we going to save our cities, you will get a plethora of perspectives, all in the declarative, none of which would, is an immediate reaction. But when you ask something with existential depth, like, are we going to choose to nurture our children? There's not a lot of dispute you get around that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I came home to a city that had lost 10,000 of its 50,000 jobs in 8 years. It
Yeah.
was an economy in crisis. I had closed one of the first factories in 1984, and nobody knew what to do. The place was absolutely panicked and frozen. And six of us were invited to write editorials, and I wrote that um, if you wanted to make economic progress, you were going to have to change the categories of thought. I learned it from Moynihan. And it was summarily rejected by the dominant business guy in the community. He was president of Titleist, the golf operation. He's a big deal. I wasn't. And so he's a generation older, and he basically called me and said, candidly, my wife and I have read your editorial each twice, and we don't know what you're talking about.
Mm.
So I think that we are so obsessively declarative and our language is political that the language we need to be thinking in, or at least to change the language to get to something more root cause in its existential gravity, is to recognize that all of this chaos, this depression, this denial, this are all manifestations of grief.
Mm-hmm.
So we have begun a process. So back in the 90s, we were invited to meet with the editorial staff of the local paper because a few of us had been chatting, and we were chatting with them, and we were talking about sustainable development. We're within 12 miles of Woods Hole. One of the people in the room was married to the man who literally invented coastal wetland science. Another was a fellow who was 42. He was a professor, a postdoc out of Woods Hole, who was actually chairman of the UN Commission setting policies for the oceans for the next 100 years. Our mayor went to Washington. I came home, and our mayor went to Washington to chair the first Office of Sustainable Development for the Clinton White House. We knew something about sustainable development. It was 1993. Very few people had been thinking about it. It was only defined by the Brundtland Commission of the UN in 1986, I think it was.
Yeah. I mean, I went to the summit in Rio. I think it was 92.
Yeah, there it is. So it's new, fresh stuff. And he said, we don't know what you're talking about. And I said, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist and shouldn't be reported on. And he gave us the editorial page of the paper 2 days a week for as long as we could fill it. Now, there were only about 8 of us in that meeting. And I wrote the initial editorial, and the fellow who was the ocean policy scholar wrote the second editorial. And but the paper basically said, we're an economy in crisis. We're looking for new leadership. It seems to be emerging. Here are a few editorials. Tell us what you think. And 7 weeks and 44 editorials later, we had the beginnings of what we ended up calling the No Name Forum.
I
So
see.
the so the journalism becomes invocation.
Right.
And Tom and I were talking yesterday. Again, Tom Flanagan is the one who
Right.
wrote the book with Christakis on the talking point. Tom and I met yesterday for the second time with the publisher of a local electronic newspaper that's being watched for its viability, um, and presented the concept of journalism as invocation.
Right.
Report on what is there in the population that the population is not talking about.
Yes.
Then what we found out by doing the forum was you came to the forum, but you entered as a citizen and you left your politics and your profession at the door.
Hmm.
And anybody who showed up because they needed to be there more than they wanted to be there would basically place in jeopardy the forum, and need to be there for political reasons than for citizens reasons, would place the forum in jeopardy. And so we built a culture that purged that out of the forum for 5 years.
Okay.
And what we found out was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 years in, forum members got roles as nominating chairs in some of the nonprofits that were around, and they repacked the nonprofits with people from the forum, and all of a sudden, the mindset in the local community nonprofits was built around a somewhat hopeful agenda. Voluntary associations formed. A group tried to extend the runway into uh, swamps, to get a regional airport. We had it done, and had the $30 million aligned, and had the research done by the wetland scientist. It cost us nothing. We did it for nothing, but we did it as citizens, and we lost it to neighborhood politics. We set out to start the fourth largest aquarium in the world. We set out to secure the national whaling urban national park around the whaling industry that had been here, that wasn't going anywhere, and we got that done. We took down a Morse cutting tool, which was a cutting tool operation that was 6 blocks from the water, and at 10 years, 15 years after it had stopped functioning, was still leaching oil into the harbor. Those kinds of things and that was done by a community activists, get the right people at the forum, conduct the forum did nothing but talk. But what it cultivated, and we were intentionally trying to cultivate, in the end, we realized this was what was going on, was voluntary associations.
Right.
So think about a process that is invocation, convocation with the forum,
Hmm.
design with a design process, which we can talk more about, with
Right.
the idea that you create the generative capacities that restore a democracy, which is voluntary associations, level 4 learning libraries, learning networks where citizens teach citizens, try and build bridges across the generational gaps that are there, so that we get the wisdom of the elderly into the middle, and try and but those are all process oriented.
Right. Right. So we've got to develop those processes and encourage people to learn about them, I guess, because we can talk about them, we can say these things, but we really perhaps need a course on this, in how to encourage this kind of process to occur at the local level, and to give people the tools they need to enable them to do it. Um,
So we have made presentations at the Frontiers of Democracy conferences that occur at Tufts University each year. We are working with a fellow named Sterling Spearin, who was the president of the CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, and then CEO of the National Conference on Citizenship. Then in retirement took over the Community Foundation in Maine. We'll be talking with him on Monday morning, because he's trying to assemble community foundations as a network through which you could basically begin to cultivate these possibilities. There's been a conversation between our chair of the new executive of our community foundation and Sterling. There have been three of them. There's been efforts in the Midwest to do this using community colleges as a network foundation for doing it. So we're all wrestling with how do we assemble something that is restorative, generative, and brings forth the interrogatory and the subjunctive to basically get it in balance with the obsessively declarative political world that we're in.
Very good. Well, you've got a number of different irons in the fire there. Then I'm wondering how we could perhaps, maybe it's next week's topic, think about giving some actual concrete steps for people to take in pursuing this course of action.
I'll be talking with with Sterling Spearin, who is the fellow I just told you about. Tom and I will be talking with him on Monday morning at length. Could I before we sign off? Could I just make a comment on design dialogue?
Of course.
The what's interesting to me about design dialogue is after you've done the reductive process of getting it down to the core issues that you want to process, when you go into the beginnings of the pairwise comparison, and I know people aren't familiar with the foundation of this, what happens is if you're carefully managing it, and I'm Tom's student on this equation, I don't know how it's done in other places, is you get a lot when you're trying to ask the question if one element that's been discussed is significantly influential in achieving another element. So it's a root cause analysis, pairwise comparison.
Right.
What we often find is when you start that process, you get a lot of yeses and nos, and people are not getting to a common understanding. It's hard to get them to agree. And if you probe at those yeses and nos, what you find is that a good portion of the people are answering the question based on what they thought they heard, not on what was said.
Yeah.
Which is the nature of common conversation. We filter everything through and so the genius of design dialogue is it purges that process and as people go through that exercise and realize that they have failed, in essence, to perform properly, and they get the resignation and the disappointment, or even the embarrassment of having failed, they ultimately realize that that's what's happening to a lot of people.
Yeah, all the time.
And all the time, but it's recognized in the design process, and so the failure moves from that inclination to withdraw to the humor of a new community that now has a bit of catharsis because of that discovery.
Sure, yeah, an engagement and a willingness to be constructive and creative in coming up with solutions or action steps or recommended actions to address the particular question that's being put to it.
And one final comment. In the final analysis, what I've learned, and it doesn't always hold true, but what you get to is what Moynihan got to. You get to something at the felt reality as the deep driver.
Right.
Like and the other pieces fall in above it. When I first did it, what I thought was the deep driver, what I thought was going to be the deep driver for this was my learning experience with it, ended up in the left-hand corner of the influence map, affecting nothing. So my considered opinion, goes to expertise. My considered opinion as an expert, this was on wastewater, and my considered opinion as an expert was completely refuted by the recognition, by taking a systematic approach to the problem.
Right. So that's interesting. So you've actually used it in your business experiences in wastewater activities.
Yes.
Okay, that's very helpful to know. Well, it's amazing how 40 minutes can whistle by.
Yes.
Which is how long we've been here. And I think this is sort of the ideal length for this. So I'll look forward to doing this again next week, and maybe we will have mapped out a bit more of a process for people to follow, and give some pointers and look at ways to start encouraging more to participate in this adventure.
So I have to work out the timing for next week, but
Okay.
we can do that offline.
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks again, and I will cease the live broadcast now.